This video on fun is brought to you by viewers like you and also in partnership with the following. Discover how Kettering University students engineered their success with Kettering's amazing co-op employment programs where students earn great pay and gain valuable experience. Those accepted into Kettering University can apply for a robotics scholarship, providing up to an additional $5,000 a year in tuition assistance. Head on over to kettering.edu/first to learn more and apply. Fun is continuing to grow and looking for new ad partners for the 2024 season. If your organization has a positive message to spread to our over 250,000 unique viewers, go to firstupdatesnow.com/contact to get more information.
Drivetrains, the base of every FRC robot. Over the last 20 years, drivetrains in FRC have evolved from simple West Coast drives into complex and intricate mechanical systems. By definition, an FRC robot is the base of the robot. It's what moves a robot from point A to point B using motors and wheels, and if you're fancy, some sensors too. Drivetrains are a crucial part of the robot and are often one of the first parts of a robot that a team begins designing and iterating upon. Most drivetrains will use motors to connect to gearboxes to transmit motion to wheels with belts or chains. Some teams will incorporate parts such as pneumatics or servos into their drivetrain as well, allowing for the shifting of gears and changing what wheels are in contact with the ground at certain points in the game. Drivetrains have various forms, each having its own pros and cons. The optimal drivetrain for a team is one that finds the correct balance of speed, maneuverability, and power to fit within the teams for the season. Hi everyone, I'm your host Riley. I am a FIRST alumni and the head coach of FRC 3481 Broncbots. I've been affiliated with FIRST since 2011 when I competed in junior FLL, and I've been a FIRStie ever since.
And I'm Stanford, mentor for FRC 2710 Jetstream and game announcer in Southern California.
So Stanford, do you want to talk a little bit about your experience with drivetrain designs?
Yeah, I mean, it's been pretty boring, which I think is how it should be. The team that I was on in high school, 1197, built West Coasts all throughout my time from 2019 to 2022. And the team I mentor now, 2710, just made the switch to Swerve.
Yeah, so I started doing FRC way back in 2015. And so I've seen a lot of the progression of the early Swerve drives into that primarily like West Coast type of culture in 2016 with Stronghold. Which was super interesting because due to the defenses that season, you really didn't see very many Swerve drives. They were kind of a lot harder to apply into the beginning of COT Swerve, which was super interesting. As a student, I only ever built West Coast. We did some shifting and some not. But, you know, as a mentor, I've watched Swerve Drive become really cool. I worked for Rev over the summer, and so I got to see some of the development behind the Max Swerve COTS parts, and so I think that's really interesting. And I feel like Swerve has really revolutionized how FRC drivetrains function, and you know the competitive nature of FRC quite a bit.
Yeah, I mean, even, my time at FIRST is relatively short compared to yours, but even when I started, the teams that did Swerve were notable, and now it's the complete opposite. The teams that do tank are notable. So like, seeing the COT Swerve come out, I mean, the team that I'm mentoring right now had 4 kids there, and we got Swerve up and running in like 4 hours. Not counting assembly of the modules. Like, we did all the wiring, we did everything, and it was all ready to go and field oriented, and just like, it was super easy, which I think is definitely a paradigm shift to when I started, when Swerve was seen as a much bigger challenge than it is right now.
Yeah, I mean, Swerve's even become so popular in that if you put a Swerve drive on an every bot or like the Rev kit bot, basically, I mean, you're creating a completely competitive robot that can compete all the way through eliminations at district events or regionals. And it's been a really crazy shift because I remember, the days where a West Coast drop center was the only way to go. If you didn't have, crazy manufacturing capabilities in shop. So it's been cool. It's been interesting to teach myself Swerve as a mentor because trying to go back from my knowledge as a student, it's not relevant anymore.
Yeah, when I was a student, I was always kind of joking about Swerve as our team, but the guiding philosophy was, it's we have to worry about the drivetrain, which is something that the team had never done to that point. And worrying about the drivetrain is always a scary thing because the drivetrain is the most important subsystem on the robot. Um, and realistically, it wouldn't have boosted our performance that much because if we made our own swerve modules, they wouldn't have been very good. We would be
Yes.
worse off for having them. And even some of the early COT swerves were a little bit funky. So it's not like we would have been better. I think the first time that wasn't true was 2022 coming out of the pandemic. We still had the West Coast that year. I think that robot would have been better if it was using Swerve.
Agreed. And we did something similar. During COVID, so I graduated in 2021. I graduated high school, and what's really interesting about that is my senior year doing school at home. What I did for fun in my free time was design my own Swerve drive that I manufactured at my house in my garage. It worked super great until you put anything more than about 10 pounds on it. Then it didn't work so good anymore. Um, but definitely fun. That's how I learned Swerve, and then watching the COT Swerve like SDS, a whole company pop up just to do Swerve Drive, basically. Watching the MK3s and then the MK4s and the MK4Is come out. It's been really cool to experience.
Yeah, I remember just going back at, early in my first career and just researching a bunch of Swerve stuff. First, I remember one of the first and most important videos I saw was, I think it was a fun video explaining how field-oriented Swerve worked. And it just kind of blew my mind of like, oh, okay, now I see why it's so good. And then going back to like 2012 and seeing what 1717's robot was doing back then, and looking back now, it's like, it looks like a 2022 robot just at like half speed. Like, but still that was incredible for like 2012 looking at it relative to the other robots on the field. Going back and like looking at all of that was like super formative as a young first student.
Historically, there have been some really unique drivetrain configurations. You have ball drive from 45 Technocats, Nona drive, which is also kind of similar to a crab drive, which is like a 4 traction wheel with 5 omni wheel and an H configuration. And those are made popular by 217 Thunder Chickens and 148 Robo Wranglers, while other teams use Mechanism drives for an omnidirectional drivetrain without the need for super complex manufacturing capabilities. 624 Kryptonite designed the Grasshopper drive, which was kind of inspired by the Droptown drive from Team 33 Killer Bees and the Hybrid H drive from 148 Robo Wranglers, effectively marrying those designs in a way that can be easily constructed using simple tools, gaining both high mobility and pushing power. Long story short, there were some teams making incredibly mobile, strong, and unique drivetrains to compete in FRC. West Coast drivetrains are one of the most popular drivetrain designs for several years. So, do you want to talk a little bit about your experience specifically with West Coast?
Yeah, I mean, the team I was on in high school built a West Coast from 2011 all the way to 2022. Actually, 2023, after I left the team, they built another one as well. And that was after they tried Mechanism in 2010 and it didn't work out. So we had a ton of experience with them, and it was always just kind of a known quantity of like, we're gonna build a West Coast drive, we know how to do it, we're gonna get it figured out on the first day, and then that's it. And learning CAD, that was the first thing I CAD'd, was a good West Coast drive, and getting kind of experience designing stuff like that was a very, very good stepping stone. That's kind of a lost art now that you just kind of need 4 pieces of aluminum and then solar modules and you've got a drivetrain. So yeah, I had a lot of experience as a student. I haven't touched West Coast since I was a student.
Yeah. So Bronkbots did West Coast from 2011 all the way through 2022. And as a student in 2019, coming out of like the 2017 2018 season where we had done 8-wheel West Coast, um, I designed a 6-wheel West Coast, and we used that same CAD, same design, and just slightly tweaked the measurements every year through 2022. So it was kind of like my same CAD got used over and over again. So I see where you're coming from with the lost art of learning how to CAD. It was also a really good way to learn how to CAD chain, because that's something that like most of my students don't know how to do anymore. But it was really cool. I mean, watching it go from, right, just a simple West Coast drive to, you see teams with drop center. You have teams that do the 8-wheel, or where they will drop the center to. Um, just being able to like test and mess around with putting omni wheels on certain corners to help your turning radius. And watching the 2016 season was so crazy because you had teams that were technically building a West Coast drive, but it was almost more like a tank, because they would put the wheels so close together for the defenses. And watching that was so interesting. I think West Coast was so popular because it's simple, right? Like, I mean, you need wheels. Theoretically, you should drop one of them, but you don't have to. And you need chain and motors. And so you could do shifting if you wanted a high gear and a low gear. You could do, I mean, you could make it as complicated or as simple as you wanted it to be. And it was a really great learning tool. Like to this day, we have active West Coast drives in our shop that we use on demo bots, or prototype bots, because it's a classic. And I make sure that my students still know what it is, how to use it, how to program it, because you'd be surprised how difficult that can be. Um, and so I think it's kind of a staple of FRC, especially for our time. I think it's less relevant now with Swerve, but for those of us who graduated really, before COVID, before and during COVID, it was really a staple.
Yeah, and that's kind of always was for us. It was always the same concept. It might have looked different year over year with subtle changes we had made based on the previous year, or maybe to slightly suit it to the like challenges of the game. But it was always that super simple concept you could go back to of like need some drop center, need a drivetrain gearbox, slap some metal together, maybe weld it, maybe put gussets on it, and you got a drivetrain. Like
Yeah.
that's what we loved about it so much was just having that be super simple. It's now arguably simpler to make a drivetrain, but we knew it very well, so it was very simple for us.
Yeah, it's also the most West Coast is also the most like arguably kittable. You still have Andy Mark where you can still get a full drivetrain kit where most of this is built in for you. Um, and it's the most easy, in my opinion, just to kind of slap together because it's a lot more simple to program. It's a lot more simple to CAD if that's something you want to do, and just simply to maintain. Arguably hardest thing about Swerve is maintaining it, and so I feel like it's just kind of a good starter drivetrain style.
Yeah, and it was also very easy to pick up for driving
Yeah.
because you could just for us we use single stick arcade for our drive controls, so people that had played video games had a very easy time with it because left is left, right is right, forward, backward, like it was all super easy to figure out. And we could get someone that with no driving experience at all moving the robot around effectively in minutes with that.
Yeah, we always programmed it in more of a tank style, just because we felt like it gave us a lot more control. But I see what you're saying. It's the same idea. It just depends on what video games you're playing.
Yeah. And actually, as someone that like I used single stick arcade when I drove for my student team, but now the Vex teams that I mentor use tank all the time, and having like had to like learn how to do both. It was an interesting like change. What's easy with single stick arcade or even like two stick arcade is not quite as easy with tank, but there's other things with tank that are easier. But it's also interesting that there's two different control schemes that are like completely different for West Coast, whereas Swerve, there's kind of basically.
We hope you're enjoying this episode of Rewind. If so, make sure you click that subscribe button and give it a thumbs up to help the algorithm. We'd like to thank this show sponsor, Kettering University, for their support of First Updates Now. Over 30% of high school students who attend Kettering University were in robotics. And if you'd like to go to a university that supports you being in robotics and their incredible programs, head on over to kettering.edu/first to learn more about what Kettering can do for you, including their amazing co-op programs to help you graduate debt-free.
While West Coast Drive was definitely the most popular and commonly used drivetrain, teams like FRC 16 Bomb Squad have been using Swerve drives since as early as like the 2010s. For most teams, this was simply not achievable with their manufacturing capabilities, but many teams with advanced tools started to develop their own Swerve drives. Going back, what was your first experience with Swerve drives? How do you feel that Swerve drives have changed FRC?
So my first experience with Swerve, I kind of heard about it, going into like my first ever regional, 2019 LA regional. But there's actually a team from Hawaii that had custom Swerve modules there, and just seeing that robot move around, especially in a pick and place game like that year, was just awe-inspiring to watch on the field and how they could, rotate and translate at the same time. Like that was super cool to see, and kind of, I was definitely a lot like more familiar with Swerve after that point, and a lot bigger of a fan. But like as for what it's done now, I think it's kind of fundamentally changed how match strategy has gone about. Like if you look back to like 2011, I know there's a lot that's different, but if you look at 2011, the cycle paths are still pretty similar. You're basically just going cross field, and defense was viable that year. You could T-bone pin a West Coast drive. Whereas if you look at this year, defense doesn't really happen as much because the robots are so maneuverable. I think that's kind of part of why how Swerve has changed everything, because robots are so maneuverable so fast now that stuff like defense, or even going back to like 2019, if you look at, a lot of the robots that here were tank and struggled to fight against defense in a tight field like that. Whereas people like Madtown that were running Swerve could get around that. If everyone's running Swerve, I don't think games like 2019 become as defense heavy of a game. Um, so maybe next year that'll change, but Swerve has kind of changed a lot about how matches kind of flow. Uh, yeah.
Yeah. So my first experience with Swerve Drive, beyond just seeing it, I interacted at a couple of regionals with Swerve teams way back when we were traveling still. But I think my first real hands-on experience was designing my own and manufacturing it at my house, and I really learned kind of the ins and out on how they worked and how to maintain them, because I feel like arguably the biggest two problems with Swerve are maintaining it and programming, right? It's so simple to just put together because of Cot Swerve now and put on a drivetrain that I see a lot of teams doing it. And then I see a lot of teams flailing at competition because they don't know how to fix it when it breaks. And they didn't think, ahead enough to purchase an extra module. And so one of the things when my team said, we want to do Swerve, I said, okay, well, let's sit down, do our research, pick some modules. Once they had picked the SDS MK4s, I said, okay, new rules. So this is going to cost us about $1,300 with motors and motor controllers and stuff. You guys are responsible for fundraising all of that money. That includes 5 modules. I want to see it on a robot. I want to see it actually functional programming wise, and I want to see that the drivers are not going to drive it like a tank drive before we compete in a season. And so we actually had Swerve capabilities going into the 2022 season, but they did not meet any of the deadlines that we had set as mentors on how functional it actually was. And so we, as the mentor team, actually vetoed the students' ability to use Swerve in 2022. Did it harm their competitive level? Almost certainly. Do I regret it? No, not even a little bit, because as soon as we put it on an actual robot and we started to see those issues, our students were a lot more prepared this season to counteract those issues than I think they would have been had they not. Um, I feel like Swerve is so great, but I see so many teams who are using programming that doesn't really support Swerve, in that it's really still being driven like a tank, or drivers who don't know how to drive it in a way that is actually useful. If you have Swerve Drive and you spent all of that money on such a complex piece of machinery and then you drive it around like a West Coast, what's the point, in my opinion? And I
Yeah.
think that was really interesting to see how that goes.
Yeah. I mean, I just wrapped up going to an off-season event where a ton of teams were trying Swerve for the first time. And among other issues, there were like almost about 50% of the matches had 6 robots moving for the entire time. Like, there's so many things that you don't consider, you're just thinking, "Oh, I'm gonna go sideways, we're gonna be the best thing out there." There's so many little things about it. Like, when we were first running our Swerve modules, we have the Rev ones, we were seeing, like, all the carpet gunk that was going into it and, like, destroying
Mhm.
our bevel gears. Like, that was something we had never, ever had to deal with before. Or stuff like our gyros freaking out in the middle of practice, and that completely affecting our ability to drive. Like, that had also never happened before. So, yeah, there's a lot of little things like that that you really have. Like, I really, really think any team that's considering doing Swerve should run it in the off season, a lot, or at least get a lot of practice before they go.
Yes.
Like, that's what we're doing. We haven't run it officially yet. We're running it this off season, and we found out a lot of things that if we had run it in the official season, it would have been a disaster.
Yes, as a field volunteer, as an FTAA and a field supervisor, carpets are getting totally wrecked. Carpets that used to last 3, 4, 5 events are now lasting 2 before they are so, I mean, just completely destroyed that you can't even use them before anymore. Um,
Yeah. At the
and
event I was just at, a team had their gyro freak out in the middle of a match. And we'll get to the whole 12 motor swerve thing, but they were running 12 motor swerve and burned completely through the carpet and then halfway through the foam tiles underneath the field. And the field was actually smoking because of
yes,
all of the energy they were sending into it.
yeah.
So yeah, carpets are getting absolutely thrashed.
Swerve Drive was a dream for most teams until kit Swerve modules started to become available. With kits like Andy Mark's Swerve and Steer modules, Swerve Drive Specialties, also called SDS, releasing the MK3, MK4, and MK4i, the West Coast product Swerve X system, and now the Robotics Max Swerve modules, Swerve has become a lot more accessible for teams with more limited manufacturing capabilities. However, in the presence of kit Swerve, the level of competition for FRC has shifted drastically, and teams have started to customize Swerve as a result. Teams like 4414 High Tide created some incredible custom Swerve drives during the 2023 season, charged up. With a whopping 12 motor Swerve, which is 3 motors on each module, 4414 was one of a few teams who truly upgraded the already competitive Swerve drive speed and strength. However, FRC recently released an update which states the following. For the 2024 season, teams will be limited to 4 motors that enable the robots to move around the field, which we are calling propulsion motors. What does that mean going forward? It means that for teams using Swerve, more than 4 modules will not be possible, and using multiple propulsion motors per module will not be allowed. In addition, teams who historically have used 6 motors on their West Coast drives will now be limited to 4, which may put a further handicap on West Coast drive teams. How do you feel that the new motor limit will affect teams?
Well, speaking specifically just to my team, we were very happy when it got announced because more than a lot of things in FRC, 12 Motor Swerve was just kind of throwing money at a problem and trying to fix it. And as a lower budget team, having to figure out how to do that. I mean, obviously, we could still be competitive with a single motor propelling each module, but if we're running like 16 feet per second and other robots are running 20, 22, the number of cycles per match absolutely changes, especially in a game like this with long runs. But so we were really happy when that kind of got announced. Realistically, I don't think it's going to change a ton across FRC. There were teams that were experimenting with this offseason, but now that we've got super powerful motors, more powerful than Falcons, robots are still going to be ridiculously fast.
Yeah, I agree. I think more on the tank and the West Coast side, I feel like this doesn't really affect Swerve teams because those 4 propulsion motors is pretty standard. But looking back at the teams who are running West Coast, a lot of the gearboxes that are offered have 3 slots on each side, and so I think that this affects West Coast and tank drives a significant amount more than it really affects Swerve, just because a lot of teams that did still do tank were doing it in a defense capability, and they were counting on that speed and power that they get from 3 motors, and this affects them more than really anyone else. But that being said, I don't think it's going to affect the current climate of FRC drivetrains significantly, not with the new motors that have been released recently.
Yeah. Well, to your point about the tank drive teams, um, when I was on the student team that I was the team that I was on as a student, we ran 6 Neo West Coast my last 2 seasons, and we totally found it was overkill. So I think most teams that were running that will still be fine. We were still traction limited, even with 4 Neos, with the speeds that we were running. Maybe that might be different with other gearings. But yeah, so it is a change that, certain gearboxes you might have bought before are not legal. I'm not really sure how much of an impact it would have generally to the tank drive teams in terms of their performance.
Drivetrains sure have changed and hopefully will continue to evolve in the coming years, whether that be due to strategy, resources, or team innovation. As drivetrains evolve, so do strategies, so keep an eye out for new designs. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave any comments down in the comment section. Thank you for the rewind.
This video on fun is brought to you by viewers like you and also in partnership with the following. Discover how Kettering University students engineered their success with Kettering's amazing co-op employment programs where students earn great pay and gain valuable experience. Those accepted into Kettering University can apply for a robotics scholarship providing up to an additional $5,000 a year in tuition assistance. Head on over to kettering.edu/first to learn more and apply. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the bell to stay up to date on our new videos. Keep the conversation going and provide your input to our content. Most live shows can be found on the First Updates Now YouTube channel, live competitions at twitch.tv/firstupdatesnow, and join our Discord at discord.gg/firstupdatesnow. Check out our social offerings on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter.